Hi guys. This is for the sophomores. If you're watching this on Wednesday before 1 o'clock, please remember that at 1 o'clock we're taking some time to remember Mr. Murphy. Um, and if you know that's it, that's very important. Because not only did we lose Mr. Murphy, we also lost Officer Castro. And I think this time is really important for us to reflect on the legacy of these two men and what they meant to our schools. So your teachers will not be giving any work, or at least they shouldn't be giving any work after 1 o'clock tomorrow. So it will give us all time to pause and reflect on these losses. If you're watching this uh, after 2 o'clock on Wednesday, then you can proceed to watch. All right, guys. So today we're going to continue talking about Reconstruction, but we're going to focus on how the lives of African Americans were affected during and impacted during these chaotic, difficult years after the Civil War. Now, the next major priority for a lot of the radical Republicans in Congress was the issue of black suffrage. Are black people are going to be able to have the right to vote? Now, it was kind of like a there were two things at work here. One cynical, one idealistic. Idealistically, radical Republicans and the Republican Party wanted black people to vote, free men. They had just gotten free from slavery, and the only way to guarantee their rights and is to make sure they have the right to vote, which is arguably the most important of all your civil rights. There was also an element of politics. Republicans needed the votes of black people in order to keep power in the South. Remember 80% of all Republican voters in the South were black. So the thing is that it was a combination of idealism and politics, as is often the case in politics and life. To be honest. So this was ironic because the thing is that the radical Republicans were demanding that Southerners give black people the right to vote, but there were still a lot of northern states that did not allow black people to vote, black men to vote. So in 1869, Congress proposed and passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment to the Constitution says your right to vote cannot be limited because of your race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Just because you had been a slave, you cannot be denied the right to vote. So this would guarantee black men the right to vote nationwide, North as well as South. Democrats predictably objected to the amendment, but the amendment was ratified in 1870. There were still 4 states in 1870 that had not been readmitted to the Union because they couldn't meet the standards that the radical Republicans had imposed on them. Mississippi, Virginia, Georgia, and Texas. And the thing is that the federal government told them, well, if you ever want to come back into the union, the only way that you're going to do that is if you ratify the 15th Amendment. Now, Southerners though sensed loopholes in the amendment. It said race, condition, and previous condition of servitude, but didn't mention anything about, well, maybe you have to pay a tax before you vote, or maybe you'll have to pass a very difficult exam before you're allowed to vote. So there were loopholes, unfortunately, in the 15th Amendment that probably were not envisioned by the people who wrote the amendment. But Frederick Douglass, who was the most important African American leader of the time, actually said that without the vote, the Negro is dead. So he realized, as did most African Americans and Republican politicians, just how important the vote for African Americans was. Now, women suffragettes objected to the 15th Amendment because they said, well, we're giving black men the right to vote. So what about women of both races? They still do not have the right to vote. Black men in America got the right to vote 50 years before women got the right to vote. So suffragettes are actually divided. There were some who said well, let me just adjust this. Okay. There were some who said that, well, the with the most important priority now is to give black men the right to vote, and eventually we can move on to women. Others said no, we can't go along with the 15th Amendment because it's not giving women the right to vote. So there was a real division. Douglas said, who supported women's suffrage himself, said that this is the Negro's hour. This is the time to give black men the right to vote. Then we can focus on women's suffrage later, which is ultimately what we did. So the 15th Amendment was very important, but Southerners really sensed a lot of these loopholes, which they used to the fullest as we got into the 1880s, 1890s, basically after Reconstruction had ended. Now, let's talk a little bit about Black life during Reconstruction. Now, the post-Civil War years. Unprecedented challenges are facing African Americans. 95% of black people in the South were illiterate. Black people, almost no black people owned any property. Many had meager skills. Most of them had spent their lives, just toiling on a plantation. But despite these challenges, the overwhelming feeling among African Americans during Reconstruction was exhilaration. You were free. The Civil War was over. Slavery was abolished, and now you had the chance to try to live your life, in some way, to find family members. A lot of white plantation owners were very angry about so many slaves leaving. One plantation mistress actually had the nerve to say, "I've never in my life met with such ingratitude that my slaves are leaving me." So we see from that quote that there's still a lot of Southerners who are completely delusional about black people, wanting freedom, right? A lot of them were still in their, delusion that, they were treating the slaves well, and and the slaves liked them. Now, some blacks moved for work. Some blacks began moving in order to find family members. And the thing is that most black people who stayed in the South, and that's most, just basically resorted to having to do plantation work once again. Because that's the jobs that were available, and that's the stuff that they were used to. Now, many black people were looking for family members. Remember, the average slave saw 11 family members sold in their lifetime. Often these were your children who were sold away from you. So the thing is that a lot of black people just wanted to look for new family members, which is one reason why a lot of, and this is an enduring mystery to a lot of people, the last names that most African Americans have are the names of their slave owners, right? And in the 1960s, this became a bigger issue. Like, why are you going to walk around with the name of your slave owner? But there were many reasons for this. But one of the reasons that black people picked the name of their plantation owners was the fact that this was a way that you could actually reconnect with family members. So if everybody who had been on this certain, had been owned by a certain person, took the same last name, then, it'd be easier to find one another. Now, there was the two institutions that were very important for newly freed slaves. The Black Church. The Black Church is very, very important for African Americans, then and now. And the thing is that it went be there. The church had a role beyond the spiritual. Black church often provided relief for the poor. They ran schools. They supported Reconstruction politically, and the ministers in the churches became the most important people in the black community. And in many ways, you could argue that's true even to this day. Now, with schools, free men sought literacy for themselves and their children. Remember, it had been illegal for white people to actually teach slaves how to read. So the Freedmen's Bureau, which, remember, had been set up by the federal government, it actually created thousands of schools in the South. 4,000 black schools were created by 1869. And each southern state had a public school system for black people. Institutions of higher education were also established for African Americans as well, institutions which are still around to this day. We call them historically black colleges. Howard University, Atlanta, Fisk, Hampton Institute, Morehouse later on. So education. That was a huge priority for a lot of the free blacks. But black schools were consistently underfunded. They were often inaccessible, and the illiteracy rate remained high among black people, even though it went down. Just give you some idea, in 1870, 85% of black Americans between the age of 15 to 20 were illiterate. In 1880, that number went down to 73%. In 1890, that number was 54%. So it's still way too high to have a majority of people illiterate, but like it's still a big improvement. So it shows that there were some advances that were made by that more than some. There were significant advances made by African Americans during these years. Segregation was still practiced, unfortunately, and it really wasn't a priority for a lot of black leaders. They were focused more on let's get an education, let's get good jobs, let's get skills. They were focused more on that, and let's preserve the right to vote. They were more focused on those things, and they were focused on integration, which later became the heart of the civil rights movement in the 1900s. In the 1950s and 60s, the main message of the civil rights movement, of course, was integration between white and black. Now you have to make a living, right? And black people had to make a living during these years. This is what one Free Black actually said was the ambition of most black people during these years. The sole ambition of the freedmen was to become the owner of a little piece of land in which to erect a humble home. So most black people in the South, as most people in general, just wanted to be able to, to live decently. Now, land ownership was extremely difficult in the American South for blacks. Land redistribution, actually taking the land from the planters and giving it to black people, that was rejected, even by the radical Republicans in Washington. There was a bill passed in 1866 called the Southern Homestead Act. Remember, we had the Homestead Act, which had given, which gave everyone 160 acres of land for free out west if they farmed for 5 years. There was a Southern equivalent that was passed in 1866, but remember, most of the land had already been taken. Right, most of the land was already owned by white plantation owners. So the land that was available often was very poor, and blacks often didn't have enough money to survive on land. Right, because the thing is, you grow crops, but then you have to wait for them to grow, and then you bring them to market. That could be months, right? And the thing is, black people often didn't have enough money even to wait a few months from the moment of planting to growing to picking it to selling it, right? What are you going to eat for those months till you actually able to sell it? Now, another thing, you don't just start going on a farm one day and then just start growing stuff, right? You need seeds, you need tools, right? Those cost money, and a lot of black people couldn't afford those. White people often didn't want to sell land to black, not often, almost never wanted to sell land to black people. So even if you had the money, you couldn't really buy the land, and black people often were needed to continue to work on white people's plantations. So the thing is, a lot of white people just weren't too thrilled about having black people leave and make their own farms. Now, a new system was created in the American South economically in the post-Civil War years. Now, basically, it was farmland, and in return, you can receive wages, which could be either cash or part of the crop, housing, and food, in return for continuing to work the land owned by white plantation owners. But as you can imagine, a lot of black people did not like the system because they felt it was similar to slavery. And the thing is that white people complained, though, that black people weren't as compliant as they had been during the slavery years, shockingly. Right? Saying that, without the element of coercion, they don't work as hard as they should. Now, a new system developed that for African Americans and for a lot of white Southerners too, which I want to talk about. The one system was called tenant farming. Now, if you can't afford to buy your own land, which most people couldn't, you could rent land. So if you're, we have a plantation owner, he owns 1,000 acres of land, you could rent 100 acres from him and pay him X amount of money every month. So basically the same as if you're in an apartment, right? You're in an apartment, you're a tenant, right? You pay rent to your landlord. So that was one system, tenant farming. But the system that but you need money for rent, right? And that's difficult often. So the system that most black people entered into in the South was a system called sharecropping. Now, sharecropping is basically where you have a lease where you can farm somebody's land, usually 30 to 50 acres of land, and you share the crop with the guy who owned the land. So if you're growing cotton, half the cotton, half the cotton would go to the guy who owned the land, and half the cotton crop would go to you. And that's the system that most black people lived in the South. That there were a lot of problems with this sharecropping arrangement. Leases did not have to be renewed, so you could be kicked off the next year. You didn't have any land yourself, right? Because you were continuing to rent the land. And also, another issue was the fact that, remember what we talked about with the tools? You still need tools. You need supplies, rakes and hoes and seeds, right? You still need those things. So the thing is, often you have to take a loan from the landowner to buy those things. So half the crop goes to him, but the half that you got to keep, often you had to use part of that money to pay off your loan for the seeds and for the supplies. So this was basically a terrible, terrible system. And if you grew cotton, which is what most people in the South did because it was a very lucrative crop, the thing is that often you were not paid in cash for your half. You just were paid in crop. So you got to keep half the crop. And that was often very difficult. Now, there were some black tenant farmers, but not many, because most people did not have the money to pay rent. So most black people were sharecroppers. 75% of black people in the South, this is how they made their living. They were sharecroppers. So this was the overwhelming majority of black people. But it should also be said that a third of white people in the South also were sharecroppers. Like Johnny Cash, for instance, the famous singer who I love. Ben Gordon, if you're listening to this, I know you like him too. His family, excuse me, his family were sharecroppers in Arkansas. So most black people were sharecroppers, but a lot of white people were sharecroppers as well. Now, lastly, there was another system that existed in the South, and this was called the crop lien system. And it kind of went hand in glove. Can you read that? LIE. It went hand in glove with sharecropping. Now, with slaves, slaves could no longer be used as collateral for loans, right? Because it used to be like, well, to this day, like say you want a loan, right? Often you have to show collateral, right? You have to put like a mortgage, right? Or a car, right? I want to borrow $10,000 and here's my car, and if I don't pay it back, you can take my car. Right? Collateral that was used in the South during this time, well, before the Civil War, is mostly slaves. So I put my slaves as collateral and I use that to borrow money, right? So you can take my slaves if I don't pay the loan back. Now, the thing is that what rural merchants did in the American South during this time is they gave supplies to sharecroppers on credit. In return, they put a lien on your crop for the next year, meaning they got to keep part of next year's crop in return for them lending money to you to buy supplies. So it put you in if you were a sharecropper, in a very precarious situation. Now, half the crop belonged to the guy who owned the land anyway, and your half often went to pay back these loans from these rural merchants. Fraud was common. The interest rates on these loans were huge. They were usurious. So the thing is that you are now tied to the land now because you owed money to all these people, right? So the thing is that planters were always short on money too. Like a lot of plantation owners didn't really have any money. And the thing is that, but they continued growing cotton because they at least knew they could make some money from cotton. So they didn't adopt new techniques and new crops to try. They didn't invest in new equipment. So then we had northern banks and railroads who used to gouge Southerners to ship their goods to market, or northern banks who gouged them on loans. So the South basically sunk into deep, deep poverty. And this was a situation that existed in the American South, I would argue, till the 1930s and 1940s with Franklin Roosevelt, who actually made a concerted effort to improve life in the American South. and World War II, which brought a lot of jobs to the South. So basically, for a period of 60, 70 years, the South experienced deep poverty as a result of all these things that we discussed, and not just the Black South, but also the White South. All right, guys. So hopefully you listen from start to finish. I will be posting another video in a few days. But I want you guys to also enjoy all your holidays, whether you celebrate Pesach or whether you celebrate Easter. I want you to be able to spend this time with your family. But I will continue posting new videos. So please check them out over the course of the next few days. All right. So hope you're all doing well. Thinking about you, and I miss you. I hope I'll get to see each other soon. All right.